Hello and welcome back to our series on beginning app script for HR, brought to you by Prairie HR Solutions. My name is Jake Finger, Principal Consultant here at Prairie HR Solutions, and today I would like to carry on with our discussion on learning Google Apps Script with the HR industry in mind, but I would like to get into the more exciting stuff. So what we've done so far is we have created a library of sorts of various functions and code snippets that we can use to build out more complex functions. And the reason why we've been taking it somewhat slow and deliberate at this point is because in order for us to use, say, the filter method effectively, we really need to know what the filter method is and what it does and the why behind it. Because if we understand the why behind it, we can then manipulate that why to actually get it to do what it is we need to do. And plus, we have nice little code snippets that if we ever need to use filter, we just come here, grab it, copy and paste it, and then change what it is that we need to change. So we have this library of various um, code instructions that we can use. And now what we can start doing is building on to our sheet here by using those snippets. And there are many other um, aspects of AppScript and JavaScript that we're going to get into. But now that we have the foundation, we are able to use those, and then the other aspects will come later on. So we got the basics down. And in this video, what I want to do is really talk about that automation piece. So the purpose of automating is honestly, you take what you are having to do manually, those manual process, the stuff, and have it happen automatically. And we have it happen automatically based on certain things. Like it could be time based. We want something like if we're automating an email to go out to all of our employees, we would set it on a timer. Like we want it to get sent out every second Tuesday at 8 a.m. and all the employees get a newsletter. Or we would like to have a function run automatically, say when something in our spreadsheet changes. Somebody deleted something or typed some nonsense in a field, we would run a function based on that change. And then what we can also do is have it's set on something like a calendar or maybe even a change to a Google Drive. Like if you do something with a file or you create a folder, it'll automatically run something else. And this comes in handy if you are auto populating, say, an employee handbook, and you want to individualize each employee handbook instead of giving them that massive 32-page document and saying, here you go. We want to personalize it for our employees. And in order to do that, we need to populate data and then save it to a drive. So what we can do is set up what's called a trigger to when that document is saved to a drive, then it automatically emails it out. So what we're going to focus on in this episode is looking at those triggers and how we can run a function based on an event. So we don't have to manually go in and run a function. That defeats the purpose of automation. And triggers come in two different flavors. We have what's called a simple trigger, and these are our built-in functions with Google. So you have things like on open, on edit, on form submit if you're working with Google Forms. And these are triggers that are already built into Google. And then you have installable triggers, and these are what users create. And these are the ones that, like us, these are the ones that are time based, the event based. They can run off calendars, the drive trigger that we talked about, and certain triggers run it certain ways. So let's think about how we authorized our code. So let's go back to our code here. When we first started writing our function, our very first function, we had to authorize. If you remember, we had to go through those steps, whole lot of scary language from Google. don't do this, we're not responsible, blah, blah, blah. And that authorization determines which type of trigger you can use, whether you need to install a trigger. And by install a trigger, I'm not saying that you have to have the user, download something. It's not like that. Um, or if you can just use a simple trigger. Now, simple triggers are essentially automatically active. You don't have to do anything additional setup wise, and no permissions are required. So you don't have to set permissions to it. But the one thing is, you can't run something or call a service like a Gmail or Drive that is going to require authorization. So if you're running a function that is wanting to get the user email, you want to track who is running the function or inside the sheet at the time, you would want to get the user ID, that Gmail account, since we're in Gmail, and that would require authorization. So you couldn't use a simple trigger for that. You would need to use a installable trigger. Now, installable triggers can make calls to those uh, to those services that need authorization, and we'll get more and more into those once we actually start developing things in our future series. But for now, just remember there's two different types of triggers. One doesn't need authorization, and two would need authorization in order to run. So we'll just simply do that. So let's get into our triggers here. For those of you who watched the previous videos, I have taken our other code here and placed it in our references just so we can clean it up. So let's look at the first simple trigger. And this is one that is used quite frequently. In fact, we'll use it once we start playing with our user interface, creating a sidebar or a web app. And what this trigger does is it runs automatically when that bound product is opened. So when we open, since we're using a Google Sheet, every time that someone opens this sheet, this function would automatically run. Now, this being this being a simple trigger uh, and a built-in function, it requires the same name. So it's one of those reserved names that we can't use unless we want to declare it as a trigger. So this is what I mean. So we have a function, and if we want that function to automatically run when, in our case, the sheet is opened, we would type on open. Now, on open is reserved by Google as a simple trigger. Anytime that you name a function on open, it is going to trigger it every time it's opened. So keep that in mind when you're naming. And what this is simply doing, I'll write a comment in here, is built-in function that runs every time the product is open. So within this function, we can have this function go in and grab the user ID. Like if you want to know who's opening or accessing your sheet, in addition to the permissions you sent, you can have that function automatically run and return or store the user ID within an array for later use. Or you can have it run a function that gets the user ID, checks it against authorized users, and if that authorized user is allowed or it's found, then it can run the function openly, or not. It just pop up alert or something saying, sorry, you're not authorized. Call HR. So that's what on open is. Pretty self-explanatory. It does what it says it does. So that's on open. So the next one is on edit. Now what on edit does, let's do function on edit. And what on edit does is just what it sounds. Anytime this sheet changes or is edited, anytime something like that happens, this function is going to run. Now, this is sort of a double-edged sword, because if you just leave it open, like you want this function to run every single time something is updated in this spreadsheet here, then that function is going to run. So if someone is going in here and just going crazy every time they change, that function is going to run. So we just ran it 8 times. But it comes in handy if we are, say, writing an entire line. If you remember, right, we were setting values based on an array or appending a row. So appending the row would be one change. So every time that we appended a row, we can run that function and say a new employee record has been created. Kick it out in an email or whatever it was that we needed. So that is a way that we can use it. For illustration purposes, let's take this cell here, item row 19, column 1, and every time something happens to this spreadsheet, let's populate some text in here, like, I don't know, something happened. So let's go back to our sheet, and what we're going to have to do is grab our active spreadsheet with the name records like we did up here. And this is a perfect opportunity to talk about local and global variables. So if we were to just come in here, because we've been using this sheet variable quite a bit, we were to just come in here and say sheet get range. I'm having a horrible time typing today. That, and then we saved it and we tried to run this thing, we would get an error. And the error we would get would be called a reference error. And as you can see, the reference error pops up. And the reason why we're getting a reference error is because within this function, that variable sheet is not defined. And you might be thinking, well, hold on a second, we wrote it up here. And we did, but we wrote it within this function. So the scope of that variable is within that function. That function is the only one that can use that variable. We're not able to call it because we're not attached. It's in a separate function. We're not attached to that function. What we can do, though, is grab that, and instead of having it inside a function, we can put it outside of a function, usually up here at top. And what that is now is called a global variable. So if we are going to be calling a spreadsheet over and over, which we typically do when we're working with spreadsheets, we can take that variable and move it up here to a global variable. Now, if we were to run it, we're not going to get that error. We're not returning anything, but we're not getting that error because it's able to call that variable. Okay, so back down here to our onEdit function. So we have this sheet.getRange 19.1, and what we want to do is set the value to that. And our value that we were going to set into that, I don't remember, I think it was something like something happened, something silly like that. Let's put an exclamation point in there just to really drive it home. So now if we save this, we can have this run automatically every time something changes in that spreadsheet. And what it'll do is it'll grab this row 19, something happened. Let me spell it right. I know somebody out there is saying, spelling. So there you go. So now let's go back to our spreadsheet and let's change something. Let's come over here and just type something in here and hit that. You'll notice that it automatically ran that. And then we come over here and type something else, type something else, type something else. We delete it and it runs. Now, this is the issue that we have if we do onEdit without thinking about what we're specifically, this is horrible language, onEditing. So you'll notice that every time that I delete something happened, that is a change. We edited that cell. So it's going to continuously run. But like I said, this is helpful depending on that situation. So let me go back here and I will comment that out because we don't want that thing to keep populating. And we'll use particularly on open in the upcoming videos. And then we'll save this. And now that it's commented out, we can come over here and get rid of that. And it won't run anymore. Okay, good. So now the next one that we have, call that simple triggers. There we go. The next one that we're going to have is what is called on install. And what this one does is if we are writing a Google app script that, if we're writing a Google app script that is going to the Google Play Store or something, or going to the internet that somebody is going to have to download or open up or do something with it. Once that Google app script is grabbed or connected or installed in another piece of code, we would want to run a function. So when we type in on install, what this on install does is it runs when an app script is installed as an add-on. So if somebody installs it as an add-on, it's going to run this script. This is a pretty advanced trigger unless you're really writing and creating those add-ons. But just so you know, it's there. We're not going to get too much into that. Maybe way into the future, but I doubt it. I don't think I've ever used OnStall because I don't produce anything in the App Store or as add-ons. I'll be the only one using it or the people that I want using it. So I just never really used it. And then the other one we have is also something that is helpful to us quite a bit. There are instances, especially if you are utilizing Google products in your company, to where we use Google Forms. And we already know that Google Forms has the ability to send an email out to the user saying, here are your responses, or notify us when, a form has been submitted. But what if we wanted to take that form and do something else with it? So, just for an example, we decided to take our onboarding process and how we collect new employee data and turn it into a form. So we wanted to get the personal data from a new employee, address, marriage, all that stuff. And we did that through a form. And then when that form was submitted, yes, we could have Google send an email back to that user saying, here are your submitted responses. We can even have them put it in a spreadsheet. Google Forms automatically does that. But what we can do with this function, with on form submit, we can then take that line, because really all it's doing is appending the row of the data. We can take that new line and do something else with it. Say we have it broken up into divisions, or we would like to send the manager a email saying that your new employee has just submitted their personal data and here it is. So now you have their contact data or whatever. We can even carve out that data to where, they don't need their demographics or whatever. Maybe they do. I don't know. Depends on the company. but at least they would need their contact information. So we can send that automatically without having to manually send it. And that's what this on submit trigger does. So what this does is this is a built-in function that runs whenever a form and this and the script, this is important, and the script, well, actually it works for all of them. Simple triggers. These are typically bound scripts to a product. And what I mean by that is in order for this on open function to run whenever a product is open, it has to be bound to that product. It's the same thing with on form submit. The script, the app script has to be bound to the form. So when you open up your form, you can go to extension. You can go to your extension in your form menu and open up the app script project file. And then that app script is bound to that specific form. So simple triggers are bound. Now, I'm not going to get too much into installable triggers. I'm going to just write a comment here. Explaining what these are. So let's go, let's say installable triggers. Now these triggers here include time-based triggers. And these time-based triggers run at specific times or intervals of time. So you can actually have a countdown. And say you have a pop-up box. And that pop-up box, it runs every single time that we open it. And it gives the instructions on how to use the sheet or the script. We don't want that thing to stay up forever, so we could set an installable time-based trigger to where it automatically closes after a certain amount of time or kicks off a email or whatever. And then we have what's called an event trigger. So now an event trigger is a lot like, that on edit. But when we think about buttons, we push a button or we do a checkbox or we created a drop-down box and then somebody selects a drop-down box item and then we want to populate a second drop-down box based on that value. That is where we would use an event trigger. On click, on change, on, whatever, that's an event trigger. So this runs in response to an action. And an event could be really anything. It can even include opening a file. So you can set an event trigger on a Google Drive file that runs every single time it opens. And then we have calendar. This is pretty self-explanatory. And what this one does is it runs based on calendar events. So an example of this would be your Google Calendar has a meeting set up. And what you're wanting to do is right before that meeting, you are wanting to open up a Google document so you have it ready to take notes, meeting notes. You can set a calendar trigger to automatically run creating that document with the template and opening it up on your screen before that calendar event or meeting occurs. So that's a handy one. I use the calendar trigger quite a bit for that actual specific reason to create my notes. And plus, it's also a great reminder. Ooh, I have a meeting in a minute. And then the other one is drive triggers. And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is just the ones that are pretty basic. And this runs in response to a change in a Google Drive. And what I mean by that is, say we have a shared drive, a network drive or whatever, and that network drive contains a whole lot of sensitive information, or you're waiting for something to be completed in it, like you tasked an employee or whatnot to do a certain thing and you want them to follow up on it. What you can do is create a drive trigger to when that drive is changed a certain way, it'll run that function. So here are some trigger options. And our next video, what we are going to do is we are going to talk about if statements. We're going to get into logical if statements. Basically, if something equals something or is less than something, then we want to run something. We want the code to do something. If it isn't, we want the code to do something else. So we're going to get into if statements. And then following that if statement, we are going to get into actually creating a UI, or and not necessarily a UI as we think, not a sidebar or a web page. What we're going to do is we are going to use on open to automatically create a validation in the form of a dropdown. So the dropdown is not actually going to exist until we open the sheet. So we'll use on open trigger to do that. Before I go though, these are the functions that are built in. But what if we wanted this pull sheet data to run when it's on open? Well, we couldn't just simply call this on open too, because we have to have unique names. So instead, what we can do is go over here to our file and see this little alarm clock looking thingy. You'll see that that is our trigger. So we can open that up, and that will open up. Yeah, we'll save that. Oh, nope, I can't do that because I have an error. Okay, but this is our trigger page. And what we can do is we can add a trigger without having to call it that built-in function. And then it'll open up this notification box here, this dialog box, and we tell it what function we want to run. And it'll pull up the names of the functions that are not built-in names. So if we wanted this pull sheet data to run every time the spreadsheet opens, and this head, don't worry about the head piece, we'll get into that. But we just want to leave it as at head. And then we want to select the event source, and we want it to run from a spreadsheet. And when we open this up from a bound script, this will either be from a form or whatever, but since we're using a spreadsheet, it's going to be triggered from a spreadsheet. We can also do time driven or from calendar, and then we can select the event type. And as you can see, instead of having to call the function name that, we can use the built-in function names here to set that trigger. So we can just simply do on open. And if we were to save this, every time that we opened this sheet, it would run that pull sheet data function. So that's just another way that we can do it. Let's delete that. Delete forever. Let's go back to our code and figure out what that error is. And I think the reason why we have an error is because we have a starting comment, but we don't actually have a closing comment. So there we go. And there we have. So now we talked about triggers. I'm going to end this video here. And the next video, what we will do is we will talk briefly about if statements, if then else statements. And the video after that, we will jump into actually creating a drop down box using our on open. So if you enjoy what we're doing, again, please hit that subscribe button. And until next time, please take care.